I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of AgLawToday, and today we have Rachel Armstrong from Farm Commons. Rachel, why don't you introduce yourself to our viewers and let us know where you're from and what you do.
Sure. Farm Commons is a nonprofit organization. We are based out of Duluth, Minnesota, which is northern Minnesota. We exist to help farmers understand how the law affects them. We provide a ton of free legal education resources at our website. So there are guides people can download, tutorials they can watch, that sort of thing. This is where I grew up. I spent most of my time, my formative years in farming, at least, in Madison, Wisconsin, and that informed a lot of what I know about farming. And I love what I do every day, helping farmers figure out how the law affects them.
So do you just work with farmers in your geographic area, or do you work for farmers all over the country?
Yeah, well, we're most well known in the Midwest simply because this is where I'm from and where my career has been built. But farmers from around the country use our website, and certainly farmers in every state. We have many state-specific resources. Most of them are for the Midwestern states and then New England. So we are, it's a little slim in what we provide folks who are in the South or the West Coast or things like that. But we're working on expanding those resources all the time and aspire to provide basic information for the 50 states.
So other than providing information, what other services does Farm Commons offer?
That's about all. We technically we can provide legal services, and I do that in Minnesota and Wisconsin where I'm licensed to practice, but it is a very small fraction, maybe 10% of what the organization does, and it is in service of our educational mission.
And what types of areas do you work with from an informational standpoint? Because agriculture law, as you know, it's so vast. It touches upon nearly everything. Are there some areas that you concentrate more heavily in?
Right. Well, our specialty is the law as it affects the direct-to-consumer farm business. So that narrows it down slightly, but not that much. Within there, farm employment law is definitely an emerging specialty of ours. Now, farm employment law is one thing. Farm employment law as applied to the direct-to-consumer farm business is even more challenging than plain old employment law. We work with a really creative entrepreneurial community who has new ideas about how they want to run their business. And it's especially complex when they start coming up with creative ways to get work done on a farm.
So that leads us into today's topic, which is volunteer farm labor. And Rachel, I believe I first heard you speak on this topic several years ago. It may have been an American Ag Law Association meeting, and then we worked together on a webinar with the American Bar Association where you spoke a lot about volunteer farm labor. And I'm going to be honest with you, as an attorney in this area, I had no idea it was so complicated until I got your materials back. And this is not so black and white, is it?
Not at all. Not at all. And that can be extremely frustrating for small business owners who simply want to move forward. They simply want to put a good idea in place and get back to work. And it can be very challenging to hear, well, we don't really know. Okay, well, the answer's not straightforward. How much risk do you want to bear? But that's just the reality of being a creative entrepreneur.
Yeah. So how prevalent is volunteer farm labor in the agriculture industry?
You know, I don't think it's that prevalent in agriculture writ large. Now, when we talk direct-to-consumer marketing, it becomes a lot more prevalent then. I would say that even 10 years ago, it had a greater predominance in the direct-to-consumer world. Most people now know what a CSA farm is, community-supported agriculture. They know that that's where people buy a share of the produce from the farm. It used to be inherent to that model that your customers would also volunteer on your farm. That's fallen out of favor. Most people don't they're not that into volunteering on the farm, but there still is this sense in the direct-to-consumer farm world that offering volunteer opportunities increases your connection to your customer, is a good marketing strategy, etc. And all that can be true too.
So what are the big categories or the different types of volunteer farm laborers?
Yeah, I think when most farmers set out to get work done on the farm, they are thinking about a few categories. First, classical employee, I could hire someone. Then they're thinking, well, I could get a volunteer. Third, they might be thinking maybe an intern is right for this job. Or fourth, maybe I just need a contractor. So those are what we see as the 4 general categories.
So let's first talk about interns. And sometimes I get questions from clients on what is the difference between an internship versus an apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts there on that?
In the world of practical law, it's a difference without a distinction. These are terms that people use to say they're a person who learns on my farm. They don't necessarily contribute a lot. I'm teaching them. Now, from a legal perspective, there is a difference. When we're talking about a legal apprenticeship, we're talking about a position that follows an approved curriculum format and has been registered with the state or the federal government as an apprenticeship.
I'm curious, what does the process look like? Like if my family wanted to have an apprentice next year to be the herdsman, how long is the process to go ahead and to hopefully get approved for the apprenticeship program?
Well, I have to be honest, the first thing I would do is back you up and say, why? Why do you want an apprentice? What are you trying to gain from this? Because if you want a labor source that is not as expensive as a traditional employee labor source, I would say you have nothing to gain. Apprentices need to be paid at least the minimum wage. It's actually more onerous to get an apprentice through a structured apprentice program because it's a ton of work to submit the thing for registration and then to actually adhere to the curriculum as it was approved.
So my father is a retired instructor at Lakeland College in Mattoon, Illinois, and so we have a lot of students that come and work on our farm. But if he wanted to say, you're an intern, mm-hmm. What would sort of be the requirements in order for him to be able to do that?
Sure. Okay. So again, let's talk what his goals are with having an intern. It's the same sort of thing as apprentice. Most of the time people are thinking, I want more flexibility than an employment position. Maybe I want to let them go and not worry about unemployment insurance, or I don't want to pay them at least the minimum wage. If that's what someone's looking for, you can do that potentially through an internship program. But according to the Federal Department of Labor, there are 6 things that need to be in place to do that. We could run through all 6, but let me just get to the one that's the knockout, in my opinion. That person can't benefit the farm. At that point, most people are going to say, oh, okay, so why would I have them? And that's kind of the point.
Right.
Yeah.
The IRS has a good, is it the IRS? I'm sorry, which agency has that
Federal
fact
Department
sheet?
of Labor.
Yes, I'm sorry. As a great fact sheet with those 6 factors, it's a good, reminder about, you're absolutely right. I mean, at the end of the day, to qualify as an intern, it actually needs to be more beneficial for the intern than it is for the farm employer. And you're kind of wondering, is it really worth it at the end of the day?
Exactly. Fact sheet 71 for anyone who wants to Google it.
That's a great fact sheet. So what are some tips for farmers or ranchers who have unpaid interns on their farm right now?
Right. Well, first thing is go get fact sheet 71 and take a look at whether you think you're complying with those 6 criteria. There absolutely are farm internship programs that do comply out there. They are not, they're not common, but it's totally possible. Number 2, if you're not in compliance with that and you would like to become compliant with that, one of the easiest ways to go is to partner with an educational institution in your area to structure the formal curriculum elements. You do need to have some sort of a formal curriculum and to be measuring the intern's success against those metrics. Easiest to do if you're an existing educational entity. So consider a partnership like that, and then make note that all employment laws need to be followed for the most part. So take a close look at what those are and consider whether those, whether your farm should be considering complying with those anyways.
Do you think that farms and agribusinesses that have interns or apprenticeships should get something formal in writing with the intern or the apprentice, similar to an employment contract or independent contractor agreement?
Right. So my advice tends to be treat the intern or apprentice the same way you treat regular employees. That's the safest way to go under all circumstances. If you use a signed agreement with your regular employees, do that with your intern or apprentice. If you don't, then I wouldn't rush to go sign one with your intern or apprentice. I would want to know, of course, as an attorney, what are you trying to gain by doing that? Why are they different? What, yeah, we got to flesh out what exactly is going on there.
Yeah, that's a really good way to look at things. So sometimes, but not always, those interns or apprentices will have free housing or food. If you have a contract that's memorialized in writing, should those type of arrangements be addressed in that agreement?
Oh, yes. And once you start offering housing, boy, oh boy, you are in a world of regulation at that point, and I definitely recommend talking with somebody who is experienced in housing for farm workers. We have a lot of very particular concerns that we need to address at that point. So that'll be the first caution. Food is a little bit easier, but it's not a free-for-all either. Yeah, it is regulated in most states what you can charge for that food, what that food needs to be comprised of. In the state of Minnesota, you have to provide milk or coffee. Like, who knew?
Oh, really?
Exactly. You never know what you're going to find. So you should check it out. And under most circumstances, there needs to be an agreement in writing that the intern will accept, this food or this lodging at this value in return for XYZ. Like, it can't be a verbal agreement.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about community volunteers. And I know that you said that community volunteers are more prevalent in the direct marketing, industry. Are there any categories of community volunteers, or what have you sort of seen here from an industry standpoint?
Right. First, I see just purely casual volunteers. These tend to be relatives or friends who come by just to help on a very occasional basis. Now, I also see much more structured volunteer opportunities. For example, again, with community-supported agriculture, we have farms that will offer a CSA share in exchange for volunteering. Now, a CSA share can run you between $500 and $700, and the volunteer position is usually designed to put in enough work to earn that much, so to speak. So it can be a significant commitment over the course of a summer.
So to go back to the first category with the casual volunteers, what should farms do from a legal standpoint to help mitigate any risks, if any, of having those casual volunteers?
I would say the first thing they need to do is talk with their insurance agent. Explain to their insurance agent the circumstances under which people are coming to their farm, to do volunteering. It may seem awkward to call up your insurance agent and say, hey, Bob, did you know that my cousin comes by twice a year to help me with the haying? But you really should. And you should confirm that in those conditions, should cousin Bob become injured, that, Bob was the insurance agent, but whatever. If your cousin falls off the hay wagon, that he's going to be covered for that. So, and honestly, that's my answer for a lot of situations. What should I do? Call your insurance agent and describe for them what's happening. Don't just say, I have a volunteer. That can mean all manner of things to all manner of people.
What about the more structured volunteers with like a CSA arrangement or a partial CSA arrangement? What should farms do from a legal standpoint?
That's another circumstance where I would say speak to an attorney, or go download a Farm Commons guide to get yourself started, but you might end up meeting with an attorney to complete your risk analysis there. It can be really dicey, and every farmer who's considering doing that wants to know what the risks are and the ways to manage the risks before they go forward with a program like that. And That's a 2-hour discussion that you and I could have. That we'll summarize by saying read the guides.
So how should farmers in those situations, especially with CSA, sort of address in-kind compensation? And what I mean by that might be with food, right? The partial CSA share, or the what are your thoughts there?
Well, it can be tricky. On one hand, most farmers who offer these positions are not intending to create an employment relationship by any means. They do not want a W-2. But under the law, a lot of these would be seen as employment situations. So farmers are going to have to do a risk assessment. Okay, do I want to call them volunteerism? Even though if push comes to shove, this could be called employment. By putting things in writing, by formalizing that, in some ways you could make it more likely that they would appear to be employment. And then you've shot yourself in the foot. You need to know if you're doing that, and if you're going to do it, you need to manage the risk of doing that. So I really feel there's no easy answer to what should I do about a structured, formal volunteerism program on my farm where I am trading labor for goods, which looks an awful lot like employment.
I'm curious in your thought on this, Rachel, because I feel like in the agriculture industry, especially with the direct-to-consumer marketing, there's just a lot of confusion with this. And farmers will come up to me and say, but I don't understand, the farmer down the road who I'm competing with has volunteers, and why don't they have the same onus and responsibility? What's your reaction to that?
Two things. A law is as good as its enforcement, of course, and these well-meaning producers who are not setting out to hurt anyone are not a strong target for preemptive enforcement. The volunteers, in figure quotes, want to be there. They are not bringing lawsuits either. So this is not an environment that is ripe for enforcement. Now, that being said, things go really wrong once we have injuries. When we have injuries, all bets are off. People start looking under rocks and turning over stones and figuring out what is going on. God forbid someone should die, like, it's over. You know, nobody feels happy anymore. So that's really the elephant in the room when what innovative farm operations are doing contrasts with what the law requires. It's that nobody's upset yet.
So what are the implications with workers' comp with all of this? You mentioned people could get hurt. Right. So if you have volunteer farm labor, do you also have to workers' compensation insurance to cover them?
So for many of the farmers that I work with, that is the ideal resolution. You have a volunteer program which is actually employment, and so you follow employment law for the most part, which includes getting workers' compensation. So this can be a really awkward phone call when you ring up your workers' comp agent and you say, I want to get workers' comp on my volunteers. And your agent says, workers' comp is for employees. And the farmer says, I know, I call them volunteers, but they're actually employees. And I don't pay them with much except a big pile of squash and zucchini and, all of these other things. So, well, are you W-2ing them? Well, I mean, so my advice ends up being not very practical when we go out into the real world, but it does happen, and it is often the best risk management strategy. So I really try to support farmers as they end up educating their own workers' comp agents about how this is possible and is the best path forward for their farm.
Do you recommend that farms do have an accounting or record-keeping system for their volunteers for in-kind compensation?
Presuming that they are following the laws, absolutely, yes. Yes. Now, if somebody is carelessly offering a volunteer position, which is actually employment, and then trying to follow it up with all this paperwork to establish that it's actually volunteerism and it really isn't, again, that is not going to help them at the end of the day.
So Rachel, we've got listeners from coast to coast. How do our listeners find an employment lawyer that can help them navigate the murky waters that is volunteer farm labor?
Huge challenge, huge challenge. For the most part, employment attorneys, if you look them up in the white pages, they're going to be highly specialized in traditional non-farm employment law. Many of them may not even know that farm employment law is another category of employment law with different rules, everywhere you turn. So it's a real challenge. I would be sure to interview the prospective attorney to see what they know about farm employment law, whether they have represented any farms. I think before you go to the white pages or go to Google, go to other farmers, see who they've used, and go from there.
Any other tips on direct questions that the agriculture producer should ask the lawyer?
Well, one of the general, this is a little unfair, but I'm going to say it anyways. You can always ask them if they know what form farmers file their taxes under. If they know a Schedule F exists, they're kind of with it. If they have no clue that a Schedule F exists, they're not that familiar with farming.
That's a good litmus test. I'm glad that I passed it. So.
Right.
All right, Rachel, how can people find you on the interwebs and learn more about Farm Commons?
Farmcommons.org. Everything we've got is free. You do need to create an account and put things in a shopping cart and check them out. Why? Because that's how I know who has my stuff. I'm a nonprofit. I'm 80% funded by grants, and I need to know what my reach is. I need to know where my documents are going so that I can report out about the amazing things we do and continue to earn money to do it.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel, for your time and your expertise today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was fun.
Welcome back to another edition of Ask Carrie. Today's question comes from an ag producer in Ohio. She writes, should I file any paperwork somewhere if I am a DBA? Well, this is a very common question that I get in agriculture, and I have to tell you that it's very common for farms and ranches to be operating as a DBA. I know even with my own farm family, it is Kurt and Pam Rinker doing business as Rinker Simmentals, or my brother is also a DBA. Even in my own self, I have my cattle, and I was a DBA with Rinker Cattle. So this is very common. And as a caveat for those ag producers that are out there and are operating as a DBA, if you haven't filed what is in some states referred to as a certificate of assumed name, and the law on this is going to vary from state to state, so you should certainly reach out to an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction on this. But if you haven't filed that necessary paperwork, if there is an issue, for example, if you enter into a contract and you want to enforce the terms of that contract, and you entered into that contract as your DBA, Rinker Simmentals, Carey's Farm, whatever it is, Smith Family Farm, and you want to enforce the terms of that contract. I know in New York, for example, where I worked for a very long time, the law would say that you cannot enforce your rights under that contract because you did not properly file that DBA. So it seems like such a simple step, but it's very important to not overlook this. In New York, for example, you need to file that certificate of assumed name with the county clerk. There is no publication requirement in New York, whereas now I've moved to Illinois, and there is a much cheaper cost as opposed to $100 in New York. It's now less than maybe $10 to file the certificate of assumed name with the county clerk. But then in Illinois, there is a publication requirement. So you can see that the law in this area does change somewhat from state to state. And this step is important even if you are an LLC and perhaps you're doing business under a different name. For example, I have formed a business entity, Carey's Farm LLC. And let's say in a few years, I decide to change the name of my farm. I have kids or whatever it is, and I want to do business now as Rinker Farm LLC. Well, that gets into a couple other issues, but you would actually need to file a DBA in that instance too. So you would need to do this if you are a sole proprietor or a general partnership or even a corporation or an LLC. But if you are doing business under a different name, it's very important that you go ahead and file that paperwork. That's today's question. And if you have a question that you would like to ask, please go ahead and email me at Carrie@rinkerlaw.com, spelled CARI, at Rinker, RINCKERLAW.com.